Peter mentioned the big shift. Well, let's kind of find out. Let's see how advertising expenditure is changing by medium and by country through the next presentation. We're delighted to be able to bring you the latest advertising expenditure forecasts from Zenith. Still the company that most organisations turn to when it comes to understanding the spend on media around the world. They've been doing these fantastic research reports for probably over 20 years, and we're going to hear the latest findings. So ladies and gentlemen, to deliver the report and to give us an insight into how the spend in our market is changing, could you please welcome the global CEO of ZenithOptimedia, Ziki!
Thank you, Charlie, for that wonderful introduction. As he says, it is actually 25 years we've been doing these forecasts. I've not presented them for all of that time. But it's roughly, we do them on a quarterly basis, about virtually 100, we think. I think actually before I start, I should just thank Charlie, because he's a magnificent host. And I was thinking earlier how, sort of 10 years ago, he had lunch with myself and my then boss, and he said, I had this idea of putting together this media conference. And I think without Charlie's tenacity, commitment and enthusiasm, we wouldn't be here. So, Charlie, to you, well done. I was rebuked. I think I've been to every one of the Festival of Media, apart from one. And I've been rebuked by his team. I didn't go to the one in Valencia, which some of you might remember. There was an ash cloud and there were no flights. And he said, well, you never came to that one. And I said, no, but there was an ash cloud, we couldn't fly. And he actually rang me up in the office. He said, Steve, I found a coach, I found a bus company that's going to take you. And I said, I'm happy to support this, Charlie, but I am not getting a bus down to Valencia. He said, no, it's the side of the bus. It's called King's Buses. And he thought that would persuade me to go. So, a wonderful enthusiast for our business. And actually, these forecasts come at a very good time. I think they speak to a lot of the themes you've heard from the other speakers during the early morning sessions. Since the Great Recession started in 2007, there have been pretty gloomy forecasts. I remember at the time in 2007, I attended the Davos Economic Forum, and a number of economist after economist said that sort of a recession brought out of an excess of debt, like the one that we're in now, or coming out of, generally lasts 10 years. I remember thinking at the time, oh my God, 10 years? How could that possibly, that sort of vista be so unrelenting? And in fact, that probably is about the case. You look what happened in the 30s, look what happened in the 1800s. That 10-year window is probably about right. So we started in 2007, it means we'll be fully out of it within the next 2 or 3 years. And in fact, one thing that we know from our forecast is that advertising exceeds the economic cycle. When the economic indicators are downward trending, economic is the first thing that gets the tap turned off. When advertisers are thinking more positively, we exceed the economic fortune. And I think you're beginning to see these in these new forecasts. In the billing for today's speech, I was lucky enough to be given by Charlie a little E, which means that they are actually exclusive. I was a bit worried when I looked at the other speakers. It was like saying Dominic didn't have something exclusive to say. But in fact, what that means is today we are releasing our new forecast. And I think you'll all be encouraged, both for what it means for our business, but I think the sort of the robustness of the way that those of us in the media agency, and you heard of the mighty Group M machine with its 24,000 employees, and I think if you look back to the beginning of the recession, when we were all worried about the frenemy, we were worried about being disintermediated, and that was definitely the case for myself running ZenithOptimedia. And yet, I think, as Dominic reflected earlier, we've come out of this recession in remarkably robust health. For my own company, we had about 4,000 people. We were dwarfed then, as we are now, by Group M, but today we've got over 7,000 employees. And I suspect most of the media agencies here have had similar sort of exponential growth as we've scaled the sort of scope of services we provide for clients. So we are in a period of new optimism. The market is expanding. My own company obviously is part of this huge merger you heard earlier. I'm really going to see much more upbeat forecasts. Forecasts we're releasing today have actually been increased for the third consecutive quarter. Two big trends, apart from the geographical shift, is firstly in mobile, I'm going to focus on that, and secondly is the expansion through the wider adoption of programmatic buying. We know from our historic analysis there are three key trends that affect advertising expenditure. And I'm just going to dwell briefly on each of those to see where they currently stand. So firstly, corporate profitability. What's the profits of the companies that invest on advertising? What's the level of GDP at a local and global level? And what's the level of consumer confidence? If those three indicators are positive, we can be pretty sure that we are looking at some robust and growth in advertising expenditure. Firstly, in terms of corporate profitability, and if you go back, you can see this is the trend. I don't know if you can all read this at the back. This is actually from 1980. Corporate profitability is not something that's accessible on an equal basis or measurable basis on a global basis. So we've just looked here for the US from the Federal Reserve economic data, and you can see that generally US corporations over that sort of 40-year period have generally trended at profitability levels of between sort of 5 and 6%. In retrospect, you can probably see that there was probably a warning indicator, that the precursor of the Great Recession back in sort of 2002, where profits rose very steeply, which began at the beginning of the Great Crash, the economic crisis, the virtual collapse of Western capitalism that happened in 2007. You can see that steady downwards dip that happened there. And then you can see from 2008, there has been a gradual recovery. And now today, in fact, the corporate profitability in the US is the highest level it's ever been since records started in 1947. But there's a reason for that. It's not because those companies have invested or expanded. It's because they have squeezed their supply chain costs. They've outsourced, they've reduced the number of factories, they've become very lean, they've tried to use technology. And one of the factors that Dominic mentioned about our business is clearly, even though we've expanded, clearly the rate that we're getting paid by our clients has been squeezed because we have to play our part in that supply chain cost line. So this is a sort of double-edged sword, but clearly corporate profitabilities give those companies the ability to invest and grow. Secondly, it's worth looking at global consumer confidence. So there are two figures I'm giving here. The lower figure is the figure for the fourth quarter of 2011, and then the same comparable figure for 2 years later, last quarter of 2013. So the average, meaning neutral confidence, is 100. So you'll see here that for Europe, not surprisingly, confidence levels relatively to the global norms are low, but they are improving. And we see that really across most of the territories, Germany, UK, most markedly improved levels of confidence, but also those infamous pigs markets, Portugal, Italy, Greece, Spain, really notable improvement in confidence as it begins to bottom out of its horrible recession, where in terms of advertising expenditure, the market of Spain is worth half of that which it was about 8 years ago. LATAM is the only region where we've slightly, you can see that Nielsen suggests that confidence is marginally down, but that's largely because of the economic problems and political unrest both in Argentina and in Brazil. You can see the growth that you've got in Middle East and North Africa despite the political unrest in that region. North America, most significant improvement, a huge shift, probably the biggest shift that's happened in the last 20 years in terms of upward improvement in consumer confidence from a figure of 84 to 95, largely coming out through the improved economic data, particularly about jobs and jobs and jobs in the US. And finally, above them all is Asia Pacific, where you can see that the trending figure is from 99 going up to 105. So overall, we've got improving global confidence from 89 from 2 years ago to a figure average norm now of 95. So we've got improving corporate profitability, at least in the US, improving consumer confidence, and finally, in terms of GDP, this is the first time since 2007 that the IMF, where we've taken these numbers from, are actually predicting that every one of the global key economic regions is actually going to increase its level of GDP. Western Europe, but not surprisingly, is the most tepid level of increase at about 1.2%. North America, current forecast is 2.6, although a lot of forecasters are now suggesting the next forecast will be closer to 3. You've got Central and Eastern Europe at about the same level as North America. Latin America at 3.1. Middle East and North Africa just under 4. And no surprise in terms of Asia Pacific at 5.2. So you can see that the three key economic indicators are all positive. So against that, our new forecast, which as I said, we've just updated over the last few weeks and presenting for the first time today, you'll see that not only is the ad market growing, but the rate of growth is also accelerating. So this year, 2014, where we've obviously got those semi-quadrennial effects, we've got the midterm in the elections in the US, which is definitely going to have an upward spike on advertising, TV advertising, particularly local. We've got the Winter Olympics and of course the World Cup. So this year you can see against the growth of 3.9 we've got 5.5% growth, similar levels of improvement. So against our previous forecast we've gone from 5.1 to 5.3 to give you some sort of sense of the improvement that we forecast over the last 2 quarters for 2014. But even though we don't have those quadrennial effects in 2015 and 16, you can see that that rate of growth continues to improve again, and I'll come on to show this both in terms of the geographical expansion, but predominantly because of the impact of mobile, which you've heard from some of the earlier speakers, and of course the impact of programmatic buying. So seeing where this growth in terms of ad spend, we've categorised, just for simplicity, broadly 3 different categories of growth. We've got what we call the slow growth markets. So this is predominantly Western and Northern Europe. We've also included Japan. So this is where, on average, over the next 3 years, we're going to see between 1 and 3% of annual growth in advertising expenditure over that next 3-year period. We've then got steady growth. So this includes the whole of North America, US and Canada. We've got most of the Middle East and North Africa and Australia and New Zealand. So you can see steady growth there, looks like 5 to 6% per annum for the next 3 years. And then we've got this fast growth. So we're seeing this very large proportion of the globe, markets where obviously companies such as ours are really trying to gain a strong foothold, including LATAM, Asia Pacific, where you can see that these markets are going to grow between 9 and 12%. When we've done these forecasts, obviously something that has really helped us grow, particularly during the last few years, and maintain our growth levels has been that of the BRIC markets, Brazil, Russia, India and China. But in fact, we now find that the level of growth in those BRIC markets is slightly slowing as those markets reach maturity. We saw over the last 10 years the BRIC markets growing at an average of 17%. We're actually going to see for the next 3 years these BRIC markets growing at a much more normalised 10%, as they have each have individual characteristics, but more normal levels of growth, much closer to the global norms. However, there are some markets now which are becoming much more interesting. These are sometimes known as the MISAX markets. These are what we call the youthful markets. So these include Philippines, Indonesia, South Korea, South Africa, Turkey, Mexico. You'll see that it's not one single geography. It's not just LATAM or Asia Pacific. They're geographically dispersed. These markets all have similar characteristics. They are all very highly populated. They have very youthful populations in terms of age. To give you an idea, the median age of the G7 markets is about 40. The median age for the BRIC markets is 31. And these youthful markets is somewhere between 25 and 26 years old. So you can see they're much more youthful. These markets are also benefiting because there's a rapid inward level of investment, and a lot of new technology is making them far more efficient in global competitors. So whereas in the past, from a global perspective, we would have been looking really very much in our internal meetings at how we were faring in the BRIC markets, these, what we've called youthful markets, are increasingly becoming much more to the fore, and you can see the level of growth that we're seeing out of these markets compared to both the global norm and that of the BRICS. I've mentioned the growth of mobile and how this is going to make a huge contribution, as we've heard earlier. So this is the global ad spend by various media category for 2013. So remember, that was a market that was about 509 billion. You'll have all experienced, don't need any chance to show you how newspapers, particularly local newspapers, have significantly declined over the last 10 years. Magazines, similarly. we've obviously seen the growth of desktop, which is now the second largest media in terms of ad spend contribution, and then television, which still accounts, as it did at the beginning of the crisis, as it did 10 years ago, for just about 40% of total ad expenditure goes through television. You'll see on the right-hand side, mobile, which is back in last year was about 13 billion out of 500 billion. So it accounts for about 2.5% of global ad expenditure in mobile. I'm then just going to go forward and look what happens to that same picture if you do this to 2016. So you can see on the left-hand side, many of you are involved in newspapers and magazines. Newspapers still declining in terms of absolute expenditure. Magazines similarly, but the rate of decline is much less marked than it was over the last periods that we've measured. That's largely because both magazines and newspapers obviously now have non-reliance just purely on print, but also strong digital products. You can see how the largest contributions to growth, however, coming on the right-hand side. So desktop, which is growing, is growing at about 8 to 10% per annum. Television is going to contribute about 30% of all growth over that period. But the single media, which is going to contribute the most growth in terms of ad dollars, is that of mobile, where we're going to see that figure grow from the 13 billion. It's going to grow about 50% per annum, and will reach 32 million by 2016. So a huge shift in terms of where that money is coming from, and for us, most of us, of course, that is money that is not being plagiarised from other categories, but a lot of that is new expenditure that would have been taken from non-measured media previously. So it's perhaps just mentioning this mobile advertising revolution, and I saw, when you saw David Shing's presentation from AOL, you see many of those experiences captured. So firstly, we've got mobile, where the ads formats, which previously, when he showed those great examples of those banner ads we used to try and push out. Now, of course, that ads are now being made for multiple formats and they need to be adapted to multiple screens. So there's much more responsive design in the type of communication that consumers are able to receive. We've seen one trend is that actually the level of growth in search had looked as though it was starting to slow down within the last 2 or 3 years, but we see that reverse now because consumers are increasingly searching using their mobile, and that is also shifting where they are searching, and we're beginning to see, as you saw some of the early examples, see people consuming in store, in the retail environment, in the cinema, and they're actually searching, and then of course next move from searching online to actually clicking and purchasing and acquiring. So we're seeing this growth both in terms of design, the new search behaviour, and of course the personal device, which is the most personal thing that we all have, it connects all of us. That is going to open up a huge opportunity in terms of programmatic buying, which all of the media agencies are trying to invest in to create higher, more effective targeting with the consumers. Obviously, the mobile, as the most personal media, is an ideal opportunity to create a much more personalised programmatic media buying than we've done in the past. So 3 real trends which we see out of that mobile device. The second is that mobile is beginning to drive owned media. This is because of the size of the screens, faster connectivity, even, I would say, in my hotel room at times last night, Charlie, despite that huge telecoms tower you've obviously built outside the hotel, you still, for some reason, seem to struggle with the Wi-Fi connectivity. I'm sure that's what you're doing. We've got the growth of shareable content. So we've got this, we've seen that social now on mobile. We saw last year, if you look at the top 200,000 websites by traffic, a quarter of that traffic was derived from the leading social platforms. We saw that last year, more than a quarter of all videos were viewed on mobile, which was up from 8%. So we've gone from 8 to 25% in 1 year. So you can see how as the devices become more connected, larger screen sizes, you can see how the mobile is becoming a much better platform for communication. Paid media, but also very importantly for owned. And this is why, for us, most of our client communication architectures, we've now tried and put the owned media at the start of the process. You heard earlier from David Shing about it becomes mobile first, think of mobile first, That's something I'm sure we're all trying to do, but also trying to make sure that it's the owned, because we know that with everybody I'm sure won't be surprised that when you put the owned with the paid media, you get much more engaged consumer response. So we've got a much more effective platform. And then when we look at the geography, how some of the geographical changes, and we can see how mobile is leapfrogging the desktop and definitely the fixed line market. So we've got two examples here. If you look globally, the last quarter of last year, across all of the emerging markets, smartphones increased by some 50% year on year. You look at the fastest growing regions like LATAM, that's 96% year-on-year growth. India's smartphones growing by 167%. Huge potential still there. We've still only got smartphone connectivity, broadband connectivity of about 20 out of 100 consumers compared to about 75 in the more developing markets. But that 20 to 25% is already 4 to 5 times higher than the penetration of fixed line. So you can see how that mobile communication is going to leapfrog not just desktop, but also fixed line and normal TV communication. So mobile is very much going to be driving the communications process in these nascent markets. And we talk about the devices, and I think those of us who were lucky or unfortunate enough to go to CES saw how it's really shifting from the device, from the handset to the consumer. And you can see how the consumer is at the heart of this communications process. Everything that was at CES was how the consumer is now going to be connected by these various devices. I know later on you're going to hear some sessions on wearable devices, about sensors that will pick up where you are. You'll have multi-screens, you'll have beacons that will pick up where you are at any one time, and huge presence from the auto manufacturers who now recognise that their car is now its own content and distribution vehicle for content. And if we live in everyone knows about the internet of everything, but now we can see it's much more about the mobile of everything. You saw that example earlier where you walk into a store, you have that facial recognition, it recognises your previous behaviour, and rather like 1984 coming through, you actually are served a coupon which is based on your previous experience, which then logs you, and then sends you into other devices, stores you, etc. But it is the consumer rather than the device that is at the centre of the everything. So we think it's the mobile of everything rather than the internet of everything. And where this is going to take us, we had our 25th anniversary last year, so we thought it might be just interesting to look at our forecast for the next 25 years. So we produced a little booklet document which is online, 2038. One of the reasons I like doing that is because I'm pretty sure I won't be around in 25 years' time to see whether these predictions come true. But I think that a lot of the things that we see today and how that mobile device and the consumer in combination is going to change the whole experience, particularly in terms of shopping. So you can see how that mobile device is going to actually change the way that retailers are selling their goods and products. There's the opportunity for retailers to actually have much more of experiential sites, consumers be able to see that device, as we saw in that example from Lego, build the device, they'll be able to click and collect, and then many of those devices and things they buy be able to actually be produced at their location in terms of 3D printing. For those of you who haven't seen the opportunity and potential of 3D printing, I think this is going to be the most significant device, piece of technology since probably the invention of the printing press. I think it would attack me on for those of you who haven't seen it, see how it's making prepared foods, how it's producing goods that then be collected up. We've thought of China and India as sort of low-cost producers of goods, and you can see how that's going to shift with the advent and the migration of 3D printing. Not from us, but there's a fantastic report by McKinsey that I would suggest everybody read, and I think it will share with you and show you and demonstrate how that mobile device, combined with the potential of the consumer, will actually recreate that whole shopping experience. So, in summary, much more bullish forecast than we've been for the last 7 or 8 years. We've seen record corporate profitability. We've seen very robust improvement or growth in consumer confidence, and GDP growing for the first time since 2006 in every single one of the major global regions. We've seen that the BRICS are still growing. China will be the second largest ad market. The rate of growth, however, is slowing, and we see these, what we call these more youthful markets, these misapps, which are now becoming much greater under our focus, much higher level of growth, as these markets are not struggling with the same sort of growing pains that we see in the BRIC markets. And finally, in terms of the single change which is creating this new dynamic is the mobile, which is the main driver of ad spend, and as we've said, not the internet of everything, but the mobile of everything. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. King. And I'll let you off. 15 out of 16 festivals isn't bad. Question? Not bad at all. I hope you found that incredibly interesting. I think, going back to my earlier point actually, TV is still showing enormous growth, and it's still the driver, isn't it? Yet we all talk about programmatic, which is sort of away from TV currently, at least local TV. What accounts for this rise?
I think the growth of television is for a few things. There's no other form of number of factors. There's no other form of communication which gives you can reach such mass audiences, and it's still relatively extraordinarily cost efficient to use television. I think the other thing is that there's an increase of supply. You look at the number of channels. I remember when I moved to the US 20 years ago, oh my goodness, there were 100 channels. Well, every one of the audience, wherever they are in the world, will have at least 20 to hundreds of channels. So there's an increase of supply. And also, during the time of economic recession, there is no more reasonable form of media consumption than television. It's a very cheap form of media for families to be entertained by. But I think one of the biggest thing, of course, is where I've neatly segmented and we've slightly sort of, for illustrative purposes, said, well, here's the expenditures on TV, and here is on desktop, and here is on mobile. And of course, the more obvious question is, well, can you really differentiate between those media categories? And honestly, I'm a little sceptical ourselves, certainly if I look forward, never mind about the past. But it's really about glass rather than TV or video. And I think those blurring of distribution points and access points is really going to make these different formats and different screens much harder to measure in the future than it has been in the past.
Well, there will be panels on that precise topic over the course of the next 2 days. Check out your agendas. I also wonder whether, because of the changes in digital, and particularly because of programmatic, where you are getting, how do I put it, agencies buying sometimes off themselves, for want of a better way of explaining it. Do you think that in the light of this sort of blurring of the lines between who are the principals, who are the owners of inventory, who are the sellers of inventory, do you think going forward it's just going to get harder and harder to produce advertising expenditure figures?
That's a sort of double-edged question, really, because you're asking me about the programmatic and then you're asking me about the difficulty in measuring. But yeah, if I could, so I'll try and answer both if you want me to. Yes. I mean, I think the first thing in terms of programmatic, I think, as some of you heard me say before, there was a wonderful book called Scientific Advertising that was written that was about, and in that the opening paragraph was something about, for the first time, advertising has now reached a science, and we can now measure exactly the response and the effectiveness of advertising. And that book wasn't now, or even it was written in the 1930s. And the reason was because it was, at that time, major advertising was about couponing. And retailers would place a coupon in a newspaper, and they'd be able to remove, the consumer would go into the store, they'd hand the consumer that coupon, and the retailer or the advertiser would know exactly the line of sight in a sort of ledger book, would know exactly how that consumer reacts. They'd know about the efficacy of a particular price promotion or the size of the ad or the newspaper that it appeared. And that's sort of the main trend behind programmatic buying. That for the first time we're actually able to really influence and reach consumers on a one-to-one basis. And that is clearly something which is driving the whole growth, along with mobile, in terms of the growth of the media. As we all are investing in WPPR, and we happen to have different business models, but at the heart of it is we are trying to reach consumers more effectively on behalf of our advertisers. That's the key trend with programmatic. And one of the reasons that we're all struggling with profitability is partly because of the squeeze by our clients, but also because we're all investing so much money in this programmatic, because we know that is going to be the future of our business. Now, I think in terms of the measurability, will it make the measurability? I think it will do. But I don't think it will matter so much, because people would, I'm sure, most of the clients here would much rather have a representation of knowing how much they've spent, where they've spent their money, and what it did to sales and awareness, rather than do I know how much money I've spent in each of these categories, in these rather anachronistic way that we've measured media spend in the past.
Do you think you'll be able to, you say that 3 years' time we'll reach the $600 billion mark, so we're talking a very, very sizable, interesting industry. Are you able to quantify the overall economic value of that $600 billion when it comes to the enterprise value of increased sales, the overall contribution of advertising investments? Quite an interesting calculation. 600 billion industry creates X times overall economic value for global commerce.
I'm sure you could create an algorithm which would calculate that. I don't have that number to mind. I do think one thing, and one of the reasons that this and other venues is so well populated, is this media business that we're in is such a broad battleground. So we used to, 10 years ago, you'd have a TV sales company, you'd have a print house. Now everybody is in the media game. So it doesn't matter whether you're a film distribution company, whether you're a telco, even if you're a bank, anybody who's got a line of communication with their consumer. So actually the measurability and the size of the market is actually a fraction of the importance really that media communications and the dialogue we have with our consumers really plays.
Yeah, very good. So increasingly hard to define for your ad spends, but positive news all round, everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a huge round of applause to Steve King.